sucking all of Soviet agriculture into a vast experiment each time he introduced another hopelessly impractical new scheme, Lysenko was ultimately responsible for the starvation of millions. But since Soviet records of the era, especially those kept by Lysenko himself, are woefully self-serving, we will probably never know the actual number of lives sacrificed on the altar of Lysenko's career. Suffice it to say that at the time of Stalin's death in 1953, the availability of meat and vegetables has been estimated by more objective analysts to have been no greater than in the darkest feudal days of Tsar Nicholas II. Lysenko's pernicious influence, however, was not limited to agriculture. If Soviet farming had its homegrown principles, Soviet science, too, needed a scientific credo of its own. It pained Lysenko and his followers to imagine the new Soviet man following so meekly in the footsteps of bourgeois Western scientists. And Lysenko's wild theories of agricultural development had boiled down to the idea that you could transform any crop so long as you subjected it to the right environment. Winter wheat could become spring wheat through a simple environmental manipulation. And it was no one-season fix, for according to Lysenko, such changes would then breed true. Acquired traits would be passed on to the next generation. Eventually, Lysenko became a full-fledged Lamarckist. In 1801, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck first published his theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, erroneously suggesting that traits acquired during an individual's life could be passed on to its offspring. Flawed though his idea was, Lamarck, unlike Lysenko, was at least trying to base his inferences on observation. In an unusual fit of experimental enthusiasm, Lysenko even commissioned experiments to disprove Mendelism, the basis of genetics in the decadent Western tradition. In his mathematical incompetence, Lysenko actually became convinced that the results refuted Mendel's ratios, even when a reanalysis of the data by a distinguished Soviet mathematician showed that, in fact, the ratios fitted Mendel's predictions exactly. Lysenko, then, was not above doing an occasional experiment, but was never one to countenance a result contradicting even the most outlandish hypothesis. The late 1930s saw a series of debates between Lysenko, backed by what have been described as his hard core of militant ignoramuses, and the Soviet genetics community, a distinguished group by the standards of the international science of the day. H.J. Muller, one of T.H. Morgan's students, and my professor in graduate school at Indiana University, went to Russia to participate in the great social experiment of communism, and found himself instead embroiled in bizarre, largely stage-managed public discussions about Lamarckian inheritance. In this era of Stalin's purges, political truths carried much more weight than mere scientific ones. To what extent Lysenko directly contributed to the repression, to use the preferred Soviet euphemism for Stalin's purges, of the geneticists who spoke against him will probably never be known. But no matter who gave the orders, the fact remains that much of the opposition to Lysenko's Lamarckian ideas simply disappeared as the 1930s drew to a close. Some geneticists heroically stood their ground as outspoken critics. Muller was forced to flee for his life. The doyen of Soviet genetics and an ardent Soviet patriot, Nikolai Vavilov, was arrested in 1940. He died in prison of malnutrition. In 1948, it was officially decreed that the debate was over. Mendelism was out, Lysenkoism was in. An absurd and tragic outcome, particularly when one considers that it came 4 years after Avery's landmark experiment, showing DNA to be the transforming Mendelian factor. The Lysenkoite response to the discovery of the double helix, incidentally, was characteristically obscurantist. It deals with the doubling, but not the division of a single thing into opposites. That is, with the repetition, with increase, but not with development. I have no idea what this means, but it seems to be consistent in its meaninglessness with Lysenko's other writings on heredity. In our conception, the entire organism consists only of the ordinary body that everyone knows. There is in organism no special substance apart from the ordinary body, but any little particle, figuratively speaking, any granule, any droplet of a living body, once it is alive, necessarily possesses the property of heredity, that is, the requirement of appropriate conditions for its life, growth, and development. Darwin was next in line for the Lysenko treatment. The out-of-control peasant made-good denied the cardinal precept of Darwinism, competition among individuals within a species for access to limited resources, and postulated, as perhaps a good communist should, that individuals do not compete, but cooperate. He went further, combining his anti-Mendelian and anti-Darwinian views in a bizarre unified theory of the origin of species. Given that organisms are molded by their environment, it should be possible, with the right environmental conditions, to transform any one species into any other. Change a warbler's diet to caterpillars, to take his favorite example, and you can produce a cuckoo. Ardent Lysenkoists from around the country were soon writing in with reports of their own transformational successes. Viruses turned into bacteria, a rabbit into a chicken. Soviet biology was itself undergoing a transformation of sorts, from science to joke. Lysenko's rejection of Darwin eventually put him in a position so awkward as to tax even his own formidable skills of political survival. Stalin's final years witnessed the great Stalin plan for the transformation of nature. In part, this involved planting a lot of trees to protect the steppes from the vicious east winds, thus moderating the climate in general. It was not a bad idea in principle, but, as one might expect, Lysenko had his notions about the best way to grow trees. Plant them in a cluster, he argued, and the individual seedlings will not compete with each other for sunlight and nutrients, but will rather cooperate for the good of the community. In the late 40s, armies of peasants fanned out across the steppe, planting oak trees in clusters in accordance with the Lysenko method. The result? Intense competition among individual trees, which enfeebled all members of each cluster. By 1956, only 4% of the oaks planted were thriving. Only 15% had even survived. The Ministry of Agriculture withdrew its endorsement of the Lysenko planting protocol, but only after a sum estimated at over 1 billion rubles had been squandered. It was a stunning setback. But so entrenched was Lysenko's authority and so crowded with his protégés were the ranks of Soviet biology that it wasn't until 1964 that the Kremlin turned its back on him for good. The barefoot professor had managed to persuade Stalin's successor that he was still the man to create a Soviet agricultural miracle. Indeed, when Khrushchev was bundled ignominiously out of office by the Soviet Central Committee and replaced with Brezhnev, it was rumored that one important reason for the intervention was a general frustration with Khrushchev's continued reliance on Comrade Lysenko. Lysenko himself died in 1976. His family requested that he be buried in the most prestigious Russian National Cemetery at the Novodevichy Convent. The request,